I'm Blair Carson, and I'm 25. 3 hours ago, I signed papers that I thought would make me Mrs. Ethan Miller. Now I'm standing in our honeymoon suite, staring at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, wondering why my brand new husband just corrected me in front of 150 wedding guests, like I was a child who couldn't read properly. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt completely humiliated on what was supposed to be the best day of your life. You'll definitely want to stick around for what happened next. The thing is, I should have seen this coming. Ethan Miller had been making little jokes at my expense for 3 years. Small things, you know, like when I'd suggest a restaurant and he'd laugh and say, Blair's always picking places that are a little ambitious for her budget. Or when I'd wear something I thought was nice and he'd tilt his head with that patronizing smile and suggest I try something more. His friends thought it was charming. His family thought it showed he was helping me grow. And me? Well, I thought love meant accepting someone's guidance, even when that guidance felt like tiny paper cuts to your self-esteem. But today was supposed to be different. Today, at this gorgeous vineyard estate in Napa Valley, I was finally going to be his wife, equal, respected, protected. The ceremony was perfect, at least on the surface. Samantha Reed, Ethan's best friend since law school, stood as his best woman because he insisted on being modern. She looked stunning in her wine-colored bridesmaid dress, her auburn hair perfectly styled, watching me with what I mistook for approval, but now recognize as something else entirely. When it came time for vows, I'd practiced mine for weeks. I wanted them to be meaningful, heartfelt. I started reading from the paper in my trembling hands, talking about how Ethan had changed my life, how grateful I was to be building a future together. I promised to love, honor, and cherish you, to support your dreams and ambitions, and to always be your partner in this beautiful adventure we're starting. Partner? Ethan interrupted with a chuckle, turning to our guests. She means junior partner, right, folks? Laughter rippled through the crowd. My parents smiled awkwardly from the front row. Ethan's mother actually applauded. And me? I stood there in my $3,000 dress, the one Ethan had insisted I buy because we can't have you looking cheap at our wedding, feeling about 2 inches tall. I finished my vows with as much dignity as I could muster, but something had shifted. In that moment, with 150 people watching, my new husband had just established exactly where I stood in his hierarchy, and it wasn't beside him. The reception was a blur of forced smiles and well wishes, from people who seemed more excited about the open bar than celebrating our union. But I kept telling myself it would get better once we were alone, once the pressure of performing for everyone else was gone. I was wrong about a lot of things back then, but I was especially wrong about what had really happened during our ceremony. 2 weeks later, I was putting away our wedding china, gifts I'd probably never use because Ethan preferred takeout and I apparently overcooked everything, when my phone rang. The name on the screen made me pause. Daniel Graves, our wedding photographer. He'd been recommended by my coworker Sarah, a soft-spoken man with kind eyes who'd somehow managed to capture beautiful moments even during Ethan's more challenging behavior. Mrs. Miller, his voice sounded strained, urgent. I need you to come to my studio today, it's important. I noticed something terrible in the photos and videos. Don't say anything to your husband. My stomach dropped. Daniel wasn't the dramatic type. If he said something was terrible, it was terrible. What kind of something? I asked, already reaching for my keys. Just come. And Blair? Come alone. The drive to his downtown studio felt endless. My mind raced through possibilities. Had he captured Ethan with another woman? Had someone said something horrible about me that he'd accidentally recorded? When I arrived, Daniel's usual calm demeanor was nowhere to be found. He looked pale, almost sick. His laptop sat open on his desk, displaying what looked like our ceremony footage paused mid-frame. I've been editing your photos for the past week, he said without preamble. I always review everything carefully. It's what you pay me for. But when I got to the document signing, he trailed off, shaking his head. What about it? He turned the laptop toward me. I need you to watch this. Really watch it. The video showed the moment when Ethan and I signed our marriage license. There I was, distracted, chatting with the officiant about the beautiful ceremony. My bouquet was in one hand and I'd set down my purse to sign the papers. Then I saw her, Samantha. She approached, ostensibly to fix my bouquet, her smile bright and helpful. But Daniel had caught something no one else had noticed. With movements that looked rehearsed, practiced, she'd picked up the folder containing our marriage documents and smoothly replaced it with another folder, identical in appearance. Ethan signed first, his signature confident and quick. Then Samantha pushed the original folder back to me, and I signed with a huge smile on my face, completely oblivious. I watched the video 3 times before the reality hit me. Those aren't the marriage papers I signed. No, Daniel said quietly. They're not. My hands started shaking. Did you see what was in the other folder? I tried to get a clear shot, but he zoomed in on the frame. The image was grainy, but I could make out partial text and what looked like an official reference number in the corner of the document. I can see its official letterhead, but I can't read the content clearly. I stared at the screen, my mind reeling. This was planned, coordinated. While I'd been worried about my vows being perfect and whether my dress looked right, my new husband and his best friend had been orchestrating some kind of document swap. Daniel, I whispered. What could they have had me sign? His expression was grim. I don't know, but whatever it was, they didn't want you to read it first. The room felt like it was spinning. Everything about my wedding day suddenly took on a sinister cast. Samantha's helpful suggestions about the ceremony timeline. Ethan's insistence that we keep the paperwork simple and quick. Even his joke about me being the junior partner. Had that been a hint about what was really happening? I sat in Daniel's studio for an hour, watching the footage over and over, memorizing every detail. When I finally left, I had a flash drive with the evidence and a growing certainty that my marriage was built on something much darker than I'd ever imagined. That night, I lay awake next to Ethan, listening to him breathe, wondering what kind of person I just legally bound myself to. And more importantly, what had I unknowingly agreed to? The next morning, I told Ethan I had a dentist appointment and drove straight to the law office of Margaret Chen, a document fraud specialist I'd found online. If you've ever had to research what to do when someone tricks you into signing papers, you'll know it's not exactly a Google search you want to be making about your own wedding. Margaret was a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who examined the footage with the intensity of someone defusing a bomb. She enhanced images, adjusted contrast, and worked with that partial reference number for over an hour. I can track this down, she said finally. Insurance companies and legal document services use reference numbers that can be searched in industry databases. Even with partial data, I might be able to access the original document. Have you ever experienced that moment when you know your life is about to change forever but you can't stop it from happening? That was me, sitting in that leather chair, watching Margaret work on her computer. 20 minutes later, she turned the screen toward me. Life insurance policy, insured Blair Carson. Beneficiary, Ethan Miller. Coverage amount, $2.5 million. The room went silent except for the hum of the air conditioning and the sound of my world falling apart. This policy was created 3 weeks before your wedding, Margaret continued, her voice carefully neutral. The signature on file matches what you signed that day, but Blair, you never applied for this policy. You never agreed to this coverage. You never named Ethan as your beneficiary. I couldn't speak. Couldn't breathe. It gets worse, she said gently. I ran a check on the marriage license filing. The legal marriage exists, but it was processed using falsified supporting documents. The real marriage paperwork was never filed properly. They substituted fraudulent forms to make the insurance application appear legitimate. The implications hit me like a freight train. Ethan had married me, but he'd built our entire legal union on a foundation of lies designed to make me sign a life insurance policy worth $2.5 million. A policy that would pay out to him if something happened to me. Margaret, I finally managed. What does this mean? She closed the laptop and leaned forward. Blair, this isn't just fraud. This suggests premeditation for something much worse. People don't take out secret life insurance policies on their spouses for sentimental reasons. I sat in my car in the parking garage for an hour, staring at the evidence Margaret had compiled. Photos of the document swap, the reconstructed insurance paperwork, a preliminary report showing fraudulent documents in our marriage filing. My phone buzzed with a text from Ethan. How was the dentist? Hope they didn't find any cavities in that sweet smile of yours. 3 weeks ago, I would have thought that was romantic. Now it felt like a threat. I drove home slowly, my mind racing. When I walked through our front door, Ethan was in the kitchen making coffee, whistling some tune from our first dance. He looked up and smiled, the same charming smile that had won me over 3 years ago. There's my beautiful wife, he said, pulling me into a hug. I missed you. I hugged him back, forcing myself to act normal while my skin crawled. This man I'd loved, trusted, planned a future with, had never intended to build a life with me. He'd planned something else entirely. That night, I started my own investigation. If there's one thing I learned from watching crime shows with my mom growing up, it's that the best time to search someone's stuff is when they think you're completely unsuspecting. So while Ethan showered the next morning, humming his usual off-key tune, I went through everything. His laptop was password protected, but Ethan wasn't exactly a cybersecurity expert. I'd watched him type it enough times to notice the pattern. It was Samantha Reed. because apparently even his computer knew who was really important in his life. I'd always thought their friendship was intense, but now I wondered if there was more to it. I found what I was looking for in his email drafts. Phase 1 complete. She signed everything without reading a word. Policy is active. Phase 2 depends on timing. Thinking 6 months minimum to avoid suspicion. Accident during hiking trip? You always said Lookout Point Trail gets dangerous in winter. Your cut is 40% as agreed. The email was addressed to Samantha, dated 2 days after our wedding. My hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped the laptop. Lookout Point was Ethan's favorite hiking spot, a trail with steep cliffs about an hour outside the city. He'd been trying to convince me to go with him for weeks, saying we needed to start building our adventure memories. And Samantha was getting paid for this, 40% of $2.5 million. No wonder she'd been so helpful with our wedding planning. I screenshotted everything and sent it to my own email, then kept searching. In his browser history, how long after marriage does life insurance pay out? Spousal death benefits, tax implications, hiking accident statistics, California. In his phone, which he'd left charging on the nightstand, months of text conversations with Samantha, planning every detail of our wedding, not the flowers and music, but the document swap, the fake supporting paperwork, even a backup plan in case I got suspicious. The shower was still running, so I kept digging. Bank statements showed massive debt I'd never known about. Credit cards maxed out. A business loan for some startup that had failed spectacularly. And then, in a folder marked insurance, I found the most damning evidence yet. Multiple life insurance quotes on me, different companies, different amounts, all requested in the months leading up to our wedding. The amounts progressed upward. $500K, $1 million, finally settling on $2.5 million. Like he'd been shopping for the best return on investment. On my life. I was sitting there, staring at documents that proved my husband saw me as a commodity, when I heard the water shut off. I quickly closed everything and slipped back into bed, pulling the covers up to my chin and pretending to sleep. Ethan emerged from the bathroom whistling, completely relaxed. He kissed my forehead before getting dressed for work. "Have a great day, sweetheart," he said. "Don't do anything too exciting without me." If only he knew. After he left, I sat in our kitchen drinking coffee from a mug that said Mrs. Miller, a wedding gift from his mother that now felt like a sick joke. I had two choices: confront him and probably end up as another hiking accident statistic, or play the game better than he was. I chose option 2. Over the next few weeks, I became the perfect unsuspecting wife. I smiled when Ethan suggested hiking trips. I nodded along when he talked about updating our estate planning. I even let him schedule a physical for me, claiming our new health insurance required it, probably just checking to make sure his investment was in good condition. But every day I was building my case, taking photos of documents, recording conversations, gathering evidence that would prove exactly what Ethan Miller had planned for his loving wife. The hardest part wasn't the evidence gathering, though. It was looking at this man I'd loved for 3 years and realizing I'd never known him at all. Every sweet gesture, every romantic moment, every time he'd called me beautiful, it had all been an elaborate performance leading up to this. But here's what Ethan underestimated. I might have been naive, but I wasn't stupid. And I just learned exactly how dangerous underestimating someone can be. 3 weeks into my secret investigation, I had enough evidence to bury Ethan Miller and his accomplice, Samantha Reed, so deep they'd need excavation equipment to see daylight. But I needed one more thing: a plan that would protect me and ensure they faced consequences for what they'd done. That's when I decided to pay another visit to Margaret Chen, the document fraud specialist. This time, I brought everything: screenshots of Ethan's emails, the fake insurance policy, bank records showing his debts, even recorded conversations where he jokingly mentioned updating our wills. Margaret reviewed everything with the thoroughness of someone who'd seen too many cases like mine. When she finished, she looked up with something between admiration and concern. "Blair, this is one of the most comprehensive fraud cases I've ever seen, and one of the most dangerous. We need to involve law enforcement immediately." "Will they take it seriously?" I asked. I mean, technically nothing has happened to me yet. Intent to commit fraud is still fraud. And what they've documented here, she gestured to the printed emails. This shows clear premeditation for insurance fraud at minimum, potentially something much worse. We spent the next hour planning my next moves. Margaret would compile everything into a formal legal brief. I would continue acting normal while secretly preparing to disappear. And then, when everything was in place, we'd pull the trigger. But first, I had one final test for my loving husband. That evening, I made Ethan's favorite dinner, homemade lasagna with that expensive wine he liked. I lit candles, put on the dress he'd complimented on our first date, and set the stage for what would be our last romantic evening together. "This is nice," he said, settling into his chair with a satisfied smile. What's the occasion? I've been thinking about our conversation last week, I said, twirling pasta around my fork, about updating our insurance and estate planning. His eyes lit up with interest. Oh yeah? I did some research, and you're absolutely right. We should have more comprehensive coverage. I reached into my purse and pulled out a folder. I actually went ahead and got quotes from a few companies. Ethan's hand stopped halfway to his mouth. You did what? Got life insurance quotes. For both of us. I slid the papers across the table with an innocent smile. I mean, if something happened to you, I'd need to be protected too, right? I watched his face carefully as he scanned the documents. Real quotes I'd obtained, showing policies that would make me the beneficiary if anything happened to him. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Blair, I don't think you understand how these things work, he said slowly. We need to discuss major financial decisions together. But you already handled the insurance, didn't you? I kept my voice light, curious. I remember signing papers at the wedding. For just a moment, panic flashed across his face. Then that practiced charm slid back into place. Those were just preliminary documents, nothing final. Oh, good, I beamed at him. So we can start fresh, make sure we're both equally protected. The rest of dinner was tense, with Ethan making excuses about needing to research companies and comparing coverage options. But I'd seen what I needed to see. Confirmation that he'd never intended for this insurance arrangement to be mutual. After he went to bed, I found him on his phone in the bathroom, whispering harshly to someone. Through the thin door, I caught fragments. She's getting suspicious. And need to move the timeline up. That night, I barely slept. I lay there listening to Ethan breathe beside me, knowing that my little test had probably just accelerated whatever timeline he and Samantha had planned. The next morning, Margaret called with news that changed everything. Blair, I've been in contact with the district attorney's office. They're very interested in your case, but they want to move quickly. Tonight, if possible. My heart pounded. Tonight? They're concerned about the escalating nature of the communications we've intercepted. That conversation you overheard last night about moving up the timeline? That's when this stops being a future threat and becomes an immediate danger. I looked around our apartment, at the photos from our wedding day, the gifts from people who thought they were celebrating love, the life I'd built with someone who'd never seen me as more than a payday. What do I need to do? Pack a bag, only essentials. We're going to get you somewhere safe while the authorities handle the rest. As I quietly gathered my things while Ethan was at work, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Control. For the first time since I'd discovered the truth, I wasn't reacting to someone else's plan. I was executing my own. Ethan Miller thought he'd married a naive woman he could manipulate and ultimately dispose of. He was about to learn that Blair Carson was much more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. At 3 p.m. on a Tuesday that started like any other, I walked out of my apartment with nothing but a small suitcase and the evidence that would destroy the man I'd once planned to spend my life with. I left my wedding ring on the kitchen counter next to a note that simply read, "Gone to my sister's for a few days. Need some space to think. B." Ethan would come home expecting his unsuspecting wife, maybe planning to suggest that romantic hiking trip to Lookout Point. Instead, he'd find an empty apartment and a woman who'd finally stopped playing by his rules. Margaret met me at the district attorney's office, where Detective Sarah Rodriguez was waiting with the kind of expression cops get when they're dealing with a particularly disgusting case. She'd reviewed all my evidence and had some news of her own. "Mrs. Carson," she said, using my maiden name deliberately, "we've been building our own case against Mr. Miller. Your evidence confirms what we've suspected about several other incidents." Other incidents? Ethan Miller has been married twice before. Both wives died in accidents within 18 months of their weddings. Both had large life insurance policies with Ethan as beneficiary. We've been investigating him for over a year, but we couldn't prove intent until now. The room went silent except for my sharp intake of breath. This wasn't Ethan's first time playing this game. I was just his latest target. "The insurance company flagged the policy you unknowingly signed," Detective Rodriguez continued. "Companies get suspicious when someone keeps taking out large policies on spouses who die young, but we needed proof of fraud in the application process. Your video evidence of the document swap is exactly what we needed." I thought about those other women who'd probably loved Ethan the way I had, who'd trusted him the way I had, women who'd never gotten the chance to discover the truth about the man they'd married. What happens now? Now we arrest Mr. Miller and Ms. Reed. The charges include conspiracy to commit fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit murder. With your evidence and our ongoing investigation, we have enough to put them away for a very long time. The arrest happened at 6:30 p.m., just as Ethan was walking into our apartment building. I watched from an unmarked police car across the street as Detective Rodriguez and her team took him into custody. Through the car window, I could see his face change from confusion to shock to something like terror as they read him his rights. Samantha was arrested simultaneously at her law office downtown. Turns out she'd been the mastermind behind the document fraud. Her legal expertise made the whole operation possible. She'd helped Ethan target women, plan their deaths, and collect the insurance money. A real partnership. Just not the kind I'd imagined when I thought they were just close friends. 2 days later, I was sitting in a coffee shop near the courthouse when Margaret called with an update. The insurance company has voided the fraudulent policy and confirmed that while the marriage is legally valid, it was obtained through fraudulent means. You have grounds for annulment. And Blair? Ethan's talking. He's trying to cut a deal by giving up information about Samantha's other clients. Apparently you weren't their only target. I hung up and sat there for a long time, watching people walk past the window. Normal people with normal problems, living normal lives where their spouses didn't plan to murder them for money. For the first time in weeks, I felt something I'd almost forgotten. Peace. Not happiness exactly, that would come later. But peace. The kind that comes from knowing you're finally safe, finally free, finally able to breathe without looking over your shoulder. My phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. The photographer who'd started this whole revelation. Saw the news. You're the bravest person I know. When you're ready to talk about what's next, I'm here. What's next? For the first time in months, that phrase didn't fill me with dread. It filled me with possibility. I finished my coffee, straightened my shoulders, and walked out into a future that was finally, completely mine. The weeks following Ethan's arrest felt like recovering from a fever. That strange, disorienting period where you're not quite sure what's real anymore. I'd moved into a furnished apartment downtown. Something temporary while I figured out what permanent looked like for someone who just discovered her entire life had been a lie. Daniel Graves had become an unexpected anchor during this chaos. Not romantically, we were both clear about that, but as someone who understood the weight of what we'd uncovered together. When he offered me a part-time position helping with his wedding photography business, I almost laughed. You want me to work at weddings? After everything that just happened? I want you to help couples capture real moments, he said simply. You have an eye for authenticity now that most people don't possess. You can spot the genuine emotions from the performed ones. He was right, of course. After months of analyzing every gesture and word for hidden meanings, I'd developed an almost supernatural ability to read people. It was like having X-ray vision for human behavior. My first wedding as Daniel's assistant was a small ceremony in Golden Gate Park. As I watched the bride and groom exchange vows, I found myself cataloging their micro-expressions, their body language, the way they looked at each other when they thought no one was watching. These people were the real deal. Nervous, imperfect, but genuinely in love. It was healing in a way I hadn't expected. What do you think will happen next? I know some of you are probably wondering how this story ends, but trust me, we're just getting to the good part. During the reception, while Daniel captured the formal portraits, I noticed the bride's sister struggling with her own relationship drama. Her boyfriend had been dismissive all day, making little comments about her dress, her hair, her choice to give a speech. The familiar pattern made my skin crawl. I found myself approaching her during a quiet moment. "Excuse me," I said carefully. I couldn't help but notice. "Is everything okay with your boyfriend?" She looked surprised, then defensive. "Why? What did you see?" "Nothing dramatic. Just small things. Comments that seem designed to make you feel smaller." Her face crumpled slightly. "He says I'm too sensitive, that I overreact to everything." I handed her my card, not for Daniel's photography business, but something new I'd been working on. "If you ever want to talk to someone who understands what that feels like, call me." That conversation planted a seed that would grow into something I never could have imagined. Over the next few months, word spread quietly through networks of women who'd attended weddings where I'd worked. I became known as someone who could spot the red flags, someone who'd been through something terrible and come out stronger. Women started reaching out, not just about abusive relationships, but about all kinds of situations where they felt manipulated, gaslighted, or trapped. I wasn't a licensed therapist, but I was something else, a survivor who'd learned to see clearly. And apparently, that was exactly what some people needed. The irony wasn't lost on me. Ethan had tried to destroy my life, but in the process, he'd given me skills that allowed me to help protect other women from men exactly like him. Every red flag I identified, every manipulation tactic I recognized, every woman I helped see her situation clearly, it felt like turning poison into medicine. Daniel and I developed an unofficial system. During wedding consultations, if he noticed concerning dynamics between couples, he'd suggest they speak with his relationship consultant, me. Sometimes it was minor issues that could be resolved with better communication. Sometimes it was women realizing they were about to marry someone who would never truly respect them. I always told them the same thing: trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. And you deserve better than someone who makes you question your own reality. But my real transformation was just beginning. Because while I was helping other women recognize the warning signs, I was also building something else. A case against the entire system that had allowed Ethan and Samantha to operate for so long. The insurance company that had processed the fraudulent policy. They'd been cutting corners on verification procedures for years. The marriage licensing office that had accepted falsified supporting documents. They'd been understaffed and overwhelmed. The legal system that had failed to catch the pattern of Ethan's previous wives' deaths. There were gaps in communication between agencies that predators like him had learned to exploit. I started documenting everything. Not for revenge, I'd moved past that, but for prevention. If I could help close the loopholes that had made my nightmare possible, maybe other women wouldn't have to live through what I had. Margaret Chen became not just my lawyer, but my mentor in understanding how these systems worked and where they failed. She introduced me to other advocates, other survivors, other people who had dedicated their lives to preventing what had happened to me. "You have a choice, Blair," she said one afternoon as we reviewed my case files. "You can rebuild your old life, or you can build something entirely new, something that ensures what happened to you never happens to anyone else." The choice felt obvious. My old life had been built on someone else's lies. This new life, this was built on my own truth. But first, I had to face one more piece of my past that I'd been avoiding. 6 months after Ethan's arrest, I got a call I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. Detective Rodriguez's voice was professional, but I could hear the satisfaction underneath. "Blair, the trial date has been set. We'll need your testimony, of course, but I wanted you to know we've built an airtight case. Ethan's previous wives, the insurance fraud, the conspiracy with Samantha Reed. He's looking at life in prison. Life in prison." I should have felt victorious, but instead, I felt oddly empty. Justice was important, but it couldn't give me back the 3 years I'd spent loving someone who'd never existed. What about Samantha? She's trying to negotiate a plea deal, claiming she was manipulated by Ethan, but the evidence shows she was the architect of most of the fraud schemes and was receiving substantial financial compensation. She's not getting any sympathy from the prosecution. After hanging up, I sat in my apartment, the real one I'd finally chosen. With sunlight streaming through windows I'd picked myself and furniture I'd selected because I liked it, not because someone else approved. It felt surreal to think that in a few weeks I'd be sitting in a courtroom telling a jury about the man I'd almost died trusting. But there was something else I had to do first. Daniel had mentioned that his business was expanding, and he needed someone to handle the consultation side permanently, helping couples prepare for their weddings, identifying potential issues, providing support for healthy relationship building. It was exactly the kind of work I'd discovered I was good at. "I want to make this official," he said over coffee at our usual place. "Blair Carson, relationship consultant and wedding preparation specialist. What do you think?" "I think," I said slowly, "that Blair Carson sounds like someone who knows what she's talking about." The first time I heard my maiden name used professionally, since the whole nightmare began, something clicked into place. I wasn't Blair Miller, the naive woman who'd been fooled by a sociopath. I wasn't even the Blair Carson who'd existed before I met Ethan. I was someone new, someone who'd been broken down and rebuilt herself stronger. That afternoon, I did something I'd been putting off for months. I called my parents. My mother answered on the second ring, her voice cautious. We'd spoken briefly after Ethan's arrest, but I'd kept the conversations short, still processing everything that had happened. "Blair, sweetheart, how are you holding up?" "I'm good, Mom. Actually, I'm really good. We saw the news about the trial. Are you sure you want to go through with testifying? It seems like it might be traumatic." I smiled, recognizing the old pattern, my parents' instinct to protect me from difficult experiences, even when those experiences were necessary for my growth. I need to do this, not just for me, but for his other victims. And for all the women who might be targeted by someone like him in the future. "You sound so different." My father's voice came from the background. They'd put me on speaker. "I am different. I'm stronger. We should have seen the signs," my mother said, her voice heavy with guilt. "When we met him, something felt off, but we thought we were being overprotective." "You couldn't have known," I assured them. "Ethan was very good at what he did. He fooled everyone." But even as I said it, I remembered the small moments when my parents had seemed uncomfortable around Ethan. The way my father's handshake had lingered a bit too long, like he was trying to take Ethan's measure. The way my mother's smile had never quite reached her eyes when Ethan made his little jokes at my expense. They'd sensed something, but like so many people, They'd dismissed their instincts in favor of social politeness. Another lesson I was learning to teach in my consultations: trust your gut, even when society tells you to be nice. The trial preparation began a week later. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Linda Walsh, walked me through my testimony multiple times, preparing me for the defense's inevitable attempt to paint me as a vindictive ex-wife seeking revenge. "They're going to try to make this about your emotional state," she warned. "They'll suggest you misinterpreted innocent actions, that you're unstable, that you've blown everything out of proportion. Let them try," I said. "I have evidence, not emotions." And I did. Months of documentation, recorded conversations, financial records, expert testimony about the insurance fraud, and most importantly, the testimony of families of Ethan's previous victims, who'd never gotten justice until now. The night before I was scheduled to testify, I couldn't sleep. Not because I was nervous. I was ready to face Ethan and tell my story, but because I kept thinking about what came after. The trial would end, justice would be served, and then what? I'd spent so many months building this new version of myself around what had happened to me, but I was starting to realize that healing meant more than just seeking justice. It meant building a life that wasn't defined by what someone else had tried to do to me. I was ready to find out who Blair Carson could become when she stopped looking backward and started looking ahead. The next morning, I put on a navy blue suit that I'd bought specifically for this moment. Professional, confident, the kind of outfit worn by someone who knew her own worth. In the mirror, I saw a woman Ethan Miller had never met. Someone who couldn't be manipulated, diminished, or destroyed. He was about to learn exactly who I'd become. The courthouse was one of those imposing government buildings designed to remind people that justice is serious business. As I walked up the stone steps, photographers from local news stations took pictures, and reporters called out questions about my heroic story of survival. I kept my head high and my expression calm. Another skill I'd learned from this whole nightmare: how to control what people could see of your emotions. Inside, the courtroom was packed. I spotted Ethan's mother in the second row, looking frail and confused. Part of me felt sorry for her. She'd lost her son to his own choices and was only now learning who he really was. But mostly, I felt nothing toward her. She was part of a life that no longer had any claim on me. When they brought Ethan in, I was surprised by my own reaction. This man who'd dominated my thoughts and dreams for months looked ordinary, smaller somehow. Prison had dimmed that charismatic glow that had fooled so many people, including me. Sitting next to his lawyer in an ill-fitting suit, he looked like what he'd always been, a predator without his camouflage. He caught my eye once and tried to smile, that same charming expression he'd used to manipulate me for 3 years. I looked right through him like he was transparent, because in a way he was. I could see every lie he'd told, every manipulation he'd used, every moment when he'd chosen to see me as prey instead of a person. Linda Walsh called me to the witness stand, and I took the oath feeling something I'd never experienced before: complete certainty in my own truth. For years, Ethan had made me doubt my perceptions, question my memories, second-guess my instincts. Those days were over. "Ms. Carson," Linda began, "please tell the court how you met the defendant." I told my story calmly, methodically, starting with our college meeting and ending with the moment I'd walked out of our apartment with evidence of his crimes. The jury listened intently as I described the gradual erosion of my self-confidence, the pattern of small humiliations, the way Ethan had positioned himself as my protector while secretly planning my destruction. When I got to the wedding day document swap, several jurors leaned forward. I described watching Daniel's footage, realizing I'd been manipulated, discovering the fraudulent insurance policy. One older woman on the jury shook her head in disgust when I explained how Ethan had researched hiking accidents while planning our romantic trips. "Ms. Carson," Linda said, "did you suspect that Mr. Miller had harmed other women?" "Not initially. But when Detective Rodriguez told me about his previous wives, everything made sense. The pattern was identical: whirlwind romance, quick engagement, wedding, followed by large insurance policy, then suspicious accidents. I wasn't his first victim. I was just the first one lucky enough to discover the truth before it was too late." The defense attorney's cross-examination was exactly as brutal as Linda had predicted. He tried to paint me as a bitter woman seeking revenge against an innocent man who'd simply fallen out of love with me. He suggested I'd fabricated evidence, misinterpreted innocent actions, and convinced myself of a conspiracy that didn't exist. I answered every question with calm precision, referring to documentation, timestamps on digital evidence, expert testimony about the insurance fraud. When he suggested I was mentally unstable, I smiled slightly. "Sir, if discovering that someone has taken out a secret life insurance policy on you and researched ways to kill you is a sign of mental instability, then I suppose I'm guilty as charged. But most people would call that pattern recognition. The gallery laughed, and even the judge smiled slightly. The defense attorney moved on quickly. When Ethan took the stand in his own defense, I watched him try to deploy every charm offensive that had once worked on me. He claimed to love me deeply, insisted the insurance policy was meant to protect me, suggested that Samantha had misled him about the legal documents. He even cried at one point, talking about how much he missed me and how sorry he was for any misunderstandings. It was a masterful performance. A year ago, it might have worked on me. Now, watching him lie under oath, I felt nothing but pity for anyone who still believed him. He was like a magician whose tricks had been exposed. Once you knew how the illusion worked, it lost all its power. The prosecution's rebuttal was devastating. They presented evidence from his previous marriages, showing identical patterns of behavior. They brought in the families of his first 2 wives, women I'd never met but whose stories mirrored my own so closely it was chilling. Sarah Martinez's sister testified about how Sarah had called her the week before she died, worried that her new husband was pressuring her to go on dangerous hiking trips. Rebecca Chen's mother described finding large insurance policies in her daughter's belongings after Rebecca's accidental drowning during their honeymoon. By the time closing arguments began, Ethan's fate was sealed. The evidence was overwhelming, the pattern undeniable. But I wasn't thinking about his punishment anymore. I was thinking about his victims, the women who'd never gotten the chance to see justice, and the women who'd never have to face him because of what we'd accomplished in this courtroom. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned with guilty verdicts on all counts, fraud, conspiracy, attempted murder, I felt something I hadn't expected: closure. Not because Ethan would spend the rest of his life in prison, though he would. Not because Samantha had also been convicted and sentenced to 25 years, though she had. But because I'd finally, completely, separated my story from his. He'd tried to write an ending where I disappeared, where I became just another casualty of his greed. Instead, I'd rewritten the story entirely. I wasn't his victim anymore. I was a survivor who'd found her voice and used it to protect other women. As I left the courthouse that day, reporters asked me how it felt to see justice served. I thought about it for a moment before answering. Justice is important, I said. But what matters more is prevention. Making sure other women recognize the warning signs, trust their instincts, and know they deserve better than someone who sees them as disposable. That night, I got a call from a woman I'd never met. "Ms. Carson, I saw you on the news. I think my boyfriend might be like your ex-husband. Can we talk?" I smiled, looking out at the city lights from my apartment window. "Of course. Let's talk." 1 year after the trial, that changed everything. Daniel and I had built something neither of us had expected. A thriving practice that combined wedding photography with relationship consulting. What started as helping nervous brides spot red flags had evolved into something much bigger. A comprehensive program that taught people to recognize healthy versus unhealthy relationship patterns before they walked down the aisle. We called it Clear Vision Wedding Services, and the irony of the name wasn't lost on me. I'd been legally blind to my own situation, but now I helped others see clearly. Our consultation room was in Daniel's expanded studio, decorated with photos from weddings where we'd helped couples work through issues and emerge stronger. Real love stories, built on foundation of mutual respect and authentic communication. These pictures served as proof that healthy relationships existed, something I'd started to doubt during my darkest months with Ethan. My phone rang as I was reviewing notes for an afternoon consultation. The name on the screen made me pause. "Mom." "Hi, honey. I hope I'm not calling at a bad time." "Never, Mom. What's going on?" "Well, your father and I have been talking, and we wanted to ask you something. Remember your cousin Julie?" I did remember Julie, my father's niece. A sweet woman about my age who'd always seemed to attract men who treated her like an accessory rather than a partner. She's getting married next month, and she's having some doubts about her fiancé. She won't talk to us about it, but she mentioned wanting to talk to someone who would understand. "We thought maybe you—" I smiled, understanding immediately. "You want me to talk to her? Only if you're comfortable with it. We know this whole experience has been difficult for you." "Mom," I said gently, "this experience made me stronger, and if I can help Julie avoid what I went through, then something good came from all that pain." Julie called me that evening, her voice shaky with nerves. "Blair, I don't know if this is weird, but your mom said you might understand what I'm going through." "Try me," I said, settling into my chair with the patience I'd learned from months of these conversations. "My fiancé David, he's wonderful most of the time, but sometimes he says things that make me feel stupid. Small things, you know? Like yesterday, I suggested a restaurant for our anniversary dinner, and he laughed and said, 'Julie, you know you have terrible taste in food. Let me pick somewhere appropriate. My jaw tightened, but I kept my voice calm. How did that make you feel? Embarrassed. Stupid. Like I can't do anything right. Her voice got smaller. But maybe he's right? I mean, he has better taste than me. He's more sophisticated. I closed my eyes, remembering every time I'd made similar excuses for Ethan's behavior. Julie, can I ask you something? When you're with your friends, do they ever suggest restaurants? Of course. And do you think their suggestions are stupid? No. I love getting recommendations from friends. We all have different favorite places. So why is it different when you make suggestions to David? Silence. Then, quietly. Because he makes me feel like my opinions don't matter. We talked for 2 hours. I didn't tell Julie what to do. I'd learned that people had to make their own choices. But I shared my story, helped her identify patterns in David's behavior, and gave her tools to recognize the difference between loving guidance and systematic erosion of self-confidence. 3 weeks later, Julie called off her wedding. She'd started paying attention to how David spoke to her, and once she saw the pattern, she couldn't unsee it. The man who'd claimed to love her had been slowly convincing her that she was incompetent, unattractive, and lucky to have someone willing to tolerate her flaws. I don't know how I got so lost, she told me after she'd ended the engagement. I used to be so confident. That's what people like David and Ethan do, I explained. They target confident women because they're a challenge. Then they systematically break down that confidence until you're dependent on their approval. It's not weakness that made you vulnerable. It was your capacity to love and trust. Julie's story was one of many. Word spread through family networks, friend groups, social media. Women started reaching out from across the country, sharing their own experiences, asking for guidance. I wasn't a licensed therapist, but I was something else. Someone who'd survived, learned, and developed expertise in recognizing the subtle signs of emotional manipulation. Daniel started incorporating relationship education into his wedding photography packages. Couples would come in for engagement photos and leave with tools for building healthy communication patterns. We developed a pre-wedding questionnaire that helped identify potential problems before they became deal breakers. Some couples worked through their issues and had beautiful, healthy weddings. Others realized they weren't compatible and ended their engagements, which was painful but ultimately positive. And occasionally, we identified situations where one partner was actively manipulating the other, and we helped the targeted partner escape before saying, "I do." Each success story felt like vindication, proof that my nightmare with Ethan had served a purpose beyond my own survival. But the work wasn't without its challenges. Some people resented being questioned about their relationships. Some partners became angry when their controlling behaviors were identified. I received threatening calls from men who claimed I was a man-hating feminist destroying their relationships. I learned to screen clients carefully, document threats, and prioritize my own safety. The trauma from Ethan had given me useful paranoia. I was hyper-aware of potential dangers and quick to establish protective boundaries. On the first anniversary of my testimony, Linda Walsh, the prosecutor, invited me to lunch. "Blair, I wanted you to know your case has become a training example for prosecutors across the state. We're seeing more insurance fraud cases being investigated because of the precedent your case set." "That's wonderful," I said, meaning it. "Have there been other arrests?" "Several. And more importantly, insurance companies have implemented better verification procedures. The loophole that Ethan exploited has been largely closed." As we finished our meal, Linda grew serious. "I have a proposition for you. The State Attorney General's office is developing a victim advocacy program. They need someone with your experience and expertise to help train law enforcement in recognizing these types of crimes. Interested?" I thought about it for a moment, imagining myself in courtrooms and police stations, teaching others to see the patterns I'd learned to recognize. "Yes," I said without hesitation. "I'm very interested." Walking home that afternoon, I reflected on the strange turns my life had taken. A year ago, I'd been a naive woman who'd nearly died for trusting the wrong person. Now I was building a career around protecting other women from similar fates. Ethan had tried to erase me, but instead, he'd accidentally created someone much more powerful than the woman he'd targeted. Someone who couldn't be silenced, manipulated, or destroyed. The irony was perfect. 2 years after the trial that changed everything, I stood in front of a room full of law enforcement officers, teaching them to recognize the signs I'd missed in my own relationship. The irony wasn't lost on me. The woman who'd been so blind to her own danger had become someone whose clarity could save others. Economic control is often the first red flag, I explained to the group of detectives and victim advocates. It starts subtle: criticism of spending habits, insistence on managing finances for your own good, limiting access to bank accounts. By the time the victim realizes what's happening, they're often financially dependent on their abuser. A detective in the front row raised her hand. What about cases where the financial abuse is more sophisticated? Like the insurance fraud in your case? That's the next level, I said, clicking to the next slide. Sophisticated abusers don't just control existing resources. They create new financial incentives for harm. Insurance policies the victim doesn't know about. Business partnerships that benefit from the victim's disappearance. Estate planning that concentrates wealth after death. I'd given this presentation dozens of times now, but it never got easier to relive the details of my own manipulation. Still, every time I saw that moment of recognition in someone's eyes, that instant when they understood how these predators operated, I knew the discomfort was worth it. After the training session, a young detective approached me. Ms. Carson, I have a case I think you should know about. A woman whose husband died in a hiking accident 6 months ago. The insurance company is asking questions. My blood chilled. What kind of questions? The policy was taken out right after their marriage, large payout. And the widow seems odd, not grieving the way you'd expect, more like someone who's relieved. I handed her my card. Send me the case file. If this woman is what I think she is, there might be other victims. That case led to the arrest of Jennifer Walsh, a woman who'd been married 4 times in 8 years. All 4 husbands had died in accidents. All had large life insurance policies. Jennifer was the female version of Ethan, a predator who used marriage as a weapon. Her arrest made national news, and suddenly I was fielding interview requests from major networks. The story of the woman who'd survived a murder plot and now helped catch other predators was apparently irresistible to producers. I did select interviews, always focusing on education over sensationalism. I wanted people to learn to protect themselves, not just be entertained by my trauma. During one TV appearance, the host asked me a question I'd been avoiding. Blair, have you considered dating again? After everything you've been through? Can you trust someone new? I paused, thinking about Marcus, the FBI consultant I'd been working with on several cases. He was kind, intelligent, and had shown nothing but respect for my boundaries and expertise. We'd had coffee a few times, and I'd found myself actually enjoying male company again. Trust isn't something you give all at once, I said finally. It's something you build gradually, with someone who proves through consistent actions that they're worthy of it. My experience taught me to pay attention to patterns of behavior, not just words or intentions. What I didn't say was that Marcus had spent months proving his trustworthiness in small ways. He asked for my opinion on cases and actually listened to my answers. He never interrupted or dismissed my insights. When I mentioned feeling uncomfortable in certain situations, he didn't question my instincts. He helped create solutions. These might seem like basic requirements for human interaction, but after Ethan, I'd learned that many men struggled with these fundamentals. After the TV interview, I drove to my new office, a space I'd rented to handle my growing consulting practice. The walls were covered with thank you letters from women I'd helped, photos from healthy weddings where Daniel and I had provided guidance, and certificates from law enforcement agencies where I'd conducted training. My assistant, Rebecca, greeted me with a stack of messages. 3 new consultation requests, 2 speaking engagements, and Marcus called. He said the Jennifer Walsh case broke open. They found evidence of 2 more victims. I felt the familiar mixture of satisfaction and sorrow that came with each successful case. Justice for the victims, but also confirmation that predators like Ethan and Jennifer were more common than anyone wanted to acknowledge. My phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. New client consultation at 3 p.m. Bride seems nervous about fiancé's family. Want to sit in? I checked my calendar and confirmed. These family dynamic cases were often the most complex, situations where loving partners were undermined by toxic relatives who saw the new spouse as a threat to their control. The bride, Amanda, arrived looking exhausted. She was marrying into a wealthy family that had made it clear she wasn't good enough for their son. The mother-in-law constantly criticized her appearance, education, and background. The siblings excluded her from family events. The fiancé loved her but struggled to stand up to his family's pressure. I feel like I'm fighting a war I can't win, Amanda confessed. They're never going to accept me. The question isn't whether they'll accept you, I said gently. The question is whether your fiancé will choose you or them when he's forced to pick. We worked with Amanda and her fiancé for several sessions, helping him understand how his family's behavior was affecting the woman he claimed to love. Some family members came around when confronted with clear boundaries. Others revealed their true colors and were excluded from the wedding. The marriage went forward, but with both partners understanding the dynamics they'd need to manage long-term. Not every story had a fairy tale ending, but most had better endings than they would have without intervention. That evening, Marcus called to update me on the Jennifer Walsh case. We found evidence of 3 more husbands, he said. Going back 12 years, this woman was a serial killer who used the legal system to cover her crimes. How many more are out there? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Too many. But Blair, because of your work, your case, your training programs, your advocacy, we're catching them faster. Insurance companies are flagging suspicious policies. Law enforcement is looking for patterns they use to miss. You've changed how these crimes are investigated. After we hung up, I sat in my apartment looking out at the city lights, thinking about the strange journey that had brought me here. 3 years ago, I'd been a naive woman planning a wedding to a man who intended to kill me. Now I was someone who helped protect other women from similar fates. The trauma would never completely disappear. There were still nights when I woke up checking the locks, still moments when unexpected sounds made my heart race. But I'd learned to channel that hypervigilance into something useful. My paranoia had become expertise. My survival had become purpose. Ethan Miller had tried to destroy me, but instead, he'd accidentally created the very person who would help ensure that predators like him faced justice. The poetic justice was almost perfect. Tomorrow, I would continue the work, teaching, consulting, investigating, helping other women see clearly what I'd been blind to for so long. But tonight, I allowed myself to feel something I'd thought I'd lost forever. Pride in who I'd become. 5 years after the night that changed everything, I stood in the conference room of the National Center for Victim Advocacy, addressing a room full of prosecutors, detectives, and social workers from across the country. The organization had invited me to speak at their annual conference about recognizing sophisticated fraud schemes targeting intimate partners. Behind me on the screen was a chart showing the dramatic increase in insurance fraud prosecutions since my case became a training template. The statistics were impressive, but what mattered more were the faces. Photos of women who'd been saved because someone recognized the warning signs I'd helped them learn to see. Pattern recognition saved my life, I told the audience, but it took almost losing everything to develop that skill. Our goal is to teach people to see these patterns before they become victims. After my presentation, a young prosecutor approached me with a familiar expression, the look of someone who'd just realized their current case fit the profile I'd described. Ms. Carson, I have a situation back in Oregon. A woman whose husband died in a boating accident. Large insurance policy. The widow's behavior doesn't match what we'd expect. And there's another woman in town whose husband died in a similar accident 2 years ago. I handed her my card. Send me the details. If we're looking at what I think we are, those women need protection before they become statistics. This was my life now. Traveling, teaching, consulting on cases that reminded me why the work mattered. Each successful prosecution, each predator caught before they could claim another victim, felt like vindication for everything I'd endured. But the personal victories were just as meaningful. That morning, I'd received a wedding invitation from Julie, my cousin who'd called off her engagement to David. She'd met someone new, a man who celebrated her opinions instead of dismissing them, who supported her goals instead of undermining them. The invitation included a note. Thank you for helping me remember who I was before I let someone else define me. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Dinner tonight to celebrate the Oregon breakthrough? Marcus and I had been together for 2 years now, a relationship built on the foundation I'd learned to require. Consistent respect, genuine partnership, and the kind of emotional safety I'd thought was mythical. He was patient with my hypervigilance, supportive of my work, and secure enough in himself not to feel threatened by my independence. More importantly, he understood that my past had given me skills he valued rather than damage he needed to fix. When I spotted manipulation tactics in his own family dynamics, he listened. When my trauma responses were triggered, he responded with compassion rather than frustration. I'd learned that healing didn't mean forgetting or pretending the past hadn't happened. It meant integrating those experiences into a stronger, wiser version of myself. That afternoon, I stopped by Daniel's studio for our monthly business meeting. What had started as his offer to let me help with difficult clients had grown into a full partnership. We now had a waiting list for our services, 3 additional locations, and a training program that certified other wedding professionals in recognizing relationship red flags. Blair, look at this, Daniel said, showing me a letter from a wedding venue owner in Chicago. She completed our certification program and identified a situation last month. Bride's family was showing classic signs of financial abuse. The venue owner connected her with resources, and the woman got help before the wedding. These ripple effects were the most rewarding part of the work. Every person we trained became another set of eyes, another potential lifeline for someone in danger. As I drove home that evening, I passed the restaurant where Ethan had proposed 3 years earlier. I used to avoid that street entirely, but now I felt nothing but gratitude for the distance between who I'd been and who I'd become. The woman who'd accepted that proposal had been looking for someone else to complete her. She'd mistaken control for protection, manipulation for guidance, isolation for intimacy. She'd been willing to make herself smaller to fit someone else's vision of who she should be. The woman I was now understood that real love expanded you rather than diminishing you. It challenged you to grow rather than demanding you shrink. It celebrated your strength rather than exploiting your vulnerabilities. Marcus was waiting for me at the restaurant, reading case files with the focused attention I'd learned to appreciate. When he looked up and smiled, I felt that familiar warmth of being seen completely and valued fully, a feeling I'd thought was impossible after what I'd been through. "How was the conference?" he asked as I sat down. "Productive. 3 new cases flagged, 2 more prosecutors trained, and a woman in Oregon who might still be alive because someone recognized the pattern. And how do you feel about that?" It was a question he asked regularly, understanding that saving others could sometimes reopen my own wounds. But tonight, I felt nothing but satisfaction. "I feel like Ethan Miller gave me the best possible revenge," I said. "He tried to erase me, and instead he created someone who makes sure other predators like him get caught." Over dinner, Marcus told me about his latest case, a human trafficking ring that had been broken up using some of the pattern recognition techniques I'd helped develop. We talked about the intersection of our work, the ways that understanding manipulation in intimate relationships connected to larger systems of exploitation and control. These were the conversations I'd never been able to have with Ethan, because they required seeing me as an intellectual equal, rather than a target to be managed. As we walked home together, I thought about the question the TV host had asked me years earlier about trusting again. The answer had evolved over time. Trust wasn't something you gave or withheld based on past betrayals. It was something you built systematically, with someone who proved through consistent actions that they understood its value. Marcus had earned my trust the same way I'd learned to give it, carefully, deliberately, with full awareness of what it meant. That night, as I updated my case files and prepared for the next day's consultations, I felt something I'd never expected to experience again: contentment. Not the desperate happiness of someone trying to convince herself everything was fine, but the deep satisfaction of someone who'd found their purpose and built their life around it. Ethan Miller had tried to write a story where I disappeared without a trace, where I became just another statistic in his predatory career. Instead, I'd rewritten the ending entirely. I was no longer the victim of his story. I was the author of my own, and in this version, the woman who'd almost been destroyed had become someone who made sure other women got the chance to save themselves. If this story resonated with you, make sure to like and subscribe for more stories about finding strength you never knew you had. Because sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the foundation for the best thing you do with your life.